Hello, sixth graders. Welcome back. Wow, what a fantastic day that we're going to have. I can't wait to get started. But before we get started with social studies, I have another joke. Again, please be seated. I don't want anybody to laugh so hard. And those of you standing fall and get injured, I'd feel guilty about that. So please be seated. Thank you. All right, here is our joke for the day. What object is king of the classroom? What object is king of the classroom? All right, are you seated? The correct answer is a ruler. Oh my gosh, isn't that amazingly funny? Oh, I can't stop laughing. That was such an amazing joke. Great job again, Mr. Griddell. Great job. Keep up the good work. All right, enough about jokes. Here we go. So we are going to continue our learning, and we're focusing today to start April 8th is where we're at right now. We're going to focus on the vocabulary for chapter 6. And if you recall from our previous learning activities, our focus for our learning targets really was the word treaty. So I'm hopeful that you really truly understand what that word means. But let's go through the terms just to make certain that you are correct. And what I would encourage you to do is to actually have your chapter 6 vocabulary learning activity out right now. And what you can do is while you're listening to me, go through each of your definitions so that they're similar to mine. And if they're not, you can always pause the video and make the correction and then move on with watching the video. All right, here we go. Let's get started. Okay, I'm going to move myself out of the way. Here we go. Word number one is westward expansion. So, in the 19th century, there was a movement of settlers and immigrants from the eastern part of the United States to the Midwest as well as the West. This was called westward expansion. In other words, more and more people were coming into the United States, and what they were doing is wanting to move westward. And some of that expansion, that westward expansion, is where settlers stopped in what is now known as the state of Minnesota, and they settled there. So that's westward expansion. And the government wanted settlers to continue to move west, but what the government needed to do first was make sure that the land that was occupied by indigenous people, like the Dakota and the Ojibwe, that they legally obtain that land through something called a treaty. So a treaty is simply a written agreement between two or more nations. In this case, the nations of the Dakota and the Ojibwe, okay, would be kind of that one group of nations, even though they're separate, and then the U.S. government. So the Ojibwe would make a treaty with the U.S. government. The Dakota would make a treaty with the U.S. government. We'll talk in more detail about the impact of these treaties and not only how it had on the settlers and the U.S. government, but also the Dakota and the Ojibwe. Ratify just simply means to approve formally. In other words, the U.S. Senate or Congress in Washington, D.C. had to ratify these treaties to formally approve them. Our next term, is territory. What you're looking at on the map on the right side is the territorial part of Minnesota. And so Minnesota in 1849 became a territory. 9 years later, in 1858, it became a state. So a territory is just part of the U.S. that is not within a state, but is organized with its own governing leaders. And the first territorial governor of Minnesota was Alexander Ramsey. He coincidentally was the second state governor of Minnesota. The first governor of the state of Minnesota was Henry Sibley. Some of you might have been to St. Paul, where our state capital is located. Ramsey County is within St. Paul. Ramsey County is named after, obviously, Alexander Ramsey. Reservation is simply land set aside or reserved by the U.S. government for use by an American Indian group like the Dakota, like the Ojibwe. And the map over on the left-hand side, it actually comes from our textbook. And what you see in the northern part of the states with that kind of goldish, yellowish, mustardish color in the northern part of our state, that's Ojibwe reservation land as it exists today. And in the South, there are only small little pockets of reservation land set aside for the Dakota. The closest one to us is Prairie Island, which is approximately a 15 to 20-minute drive from Hastings. Annuity just simply means an annual payment of food and money that the U.S. government paid to the American Indians, the Dakota and the Ojibwe, in return for their land. What we're going to find out is how much were these annuities, what were the Dakota and the Ojibwe receiving in return for their land or in exchange for their land, and were those annuities followed? In other words, were the treaties followed and promised as written for or between the Dakota and the U.S. government and the Ojibwe and the U.S. government? That just simply means something that is owed, such as money, goods, or services. The Dakota and the Ojibwe really didn't deal with money, okay? Initially, when they were making trades, if you think back to the fur trade, there was never any money exchange between the Dakota and the Ojibwe and these European fur traders or American fur traders. But that's going to come into play because at some point in time, okay, and you may have encountered this yourself where you owe somebody money, okay, the Dakota and the Ojibwe will ultimately come into debt with fur traders. How are they going to pay their debt back? Assimilation just simply means adopting the values and habits of a larger group. In other words, what the US government wanted to do as they moved further and further west and expanding its country is they wanted to get indigenous groups like the Dakota and the Ojibwe to assimilate to the European American way of life. In other words, we want to Americanize you. We want you to become like the Americans are instead of continuing your traditions and customs as you always have within your culture, the Dakota and the Ojibwe. And that is our final term. Let me just kind of pull back out. And I'm going to go back to our vocabulary assessment. So hopefully by now you have a better understanding of each of these terms. What your HOA teacher will do is provide you feedback on your sentences that you wrote, starting with assimilation in Dakota, followed by westward expansion and territory, treaty and ratify, and then of course you had your choices for the remaining two sentences. Okay, so look for that feedback from your HOA teacher. And if you do have questions for them, please contact them. If you have questions for me, as always, contact me as well. So I'm going to stop right there in talking about the vocabulary, and I'm going to go back into Schoology and specifically look at our next learning activity. And what number 2 states is read and take notes on the following section. So you're going to read A New Nation Grows and A First Land Deal on pages 6.04 through 6.07. That means you're going to read 6.04, 6.05, 6.06, and 6.07. And then you're going to use the notes that are in Schoology. And what you're going to ultimately do is turn in your completed notes, but remember to save your notes because you're going to want to use these for your learning checkpoint number 1 for quarter 4. Okay. And so just so you have an idea of what those notes and where they are, they're just simply right here. Simply click on it. Again, complete them using Kami. If you don't know how to use Kami, again, contact your HOA teacher and they can run you through it. And then what you're going to see is I kind of created the notes for us. You just simply are going to respond to this. And again, make sure you turn that in to your HOA teacher and then save these and keep these so that you can use them for learning checkpoint number 1. Okay, so I'm going to go back into our Schoology folder for today. There we go. And scroll back down to the correct date. And then you're going to complete a land treaty map. This is a little tricky, I'm not going to lie. It is a little bit more difficult. But what you're going to do with the land treaty map is, again, open it up with Kami. And then when you're getting started, I'm just going to X out of that for right now. I don't know what that is. Make sure your name's on that, just like you should have your name on your notes as well. But here's what it's asked you to do. There's a map on page 6.06 in your textbook that may help you. I strongly encourage you to use page 6.06. I'm already logged into our Northern Lights textbook. And so I just want to quickly show you what page 6.06 looks like. And I'll just get to that very quickly. Boom, there it is. Okay, so you're going to use this map to help you. You might need to utilize a different map as well to help, but what you're going to do is simply complete numbers 1, 2, and 3, and it states for number 1, label the following locations on map A, and what I did is I put arrows specifically at where those locations are. Okay, this arrow right here is pointing to a river. This arrow down here on the map A is also pointing to a river, and they're different rivers. But this is pointing to a specific site, a specific site, a specific site, and a specific site for the remaining 4. And all you need to do is to simply remember, open up a text box, and then put whatever that location is on that line. But make sure that you spell it correctly and make sure you capitalize things correctly. In other words, if you believe that this location right here is the Mississippi River, then make sure you capitalize the M and the R in Mississippi River. Then, number 2, it says trace the area inside the dotted lines that Zebulon Pike obtained from the Dakota and Ojibwe. What I'm going to ask you to do is to simply do the following. So you're going to do the drawing tools, okay? Click on whatever color you want. I'm just going to pick black. And all I want you to do is to, whoa, I did that wrong. My apologies. Let's go back to drawing. There we go. Click on black. And actually, I'm going to make this a little bit thicker. Click on black or any color you want. And all I want you to do is to simply trace around as best as you can the dotted lines. And what this is showing is anything inside these dotted lines, that's land that a gentleman by the name of Zebulon Pike, as well as people that were with him, obtained from the Dakota. And the purpose of that land was to ultimately build a fort. And the construction of this fort began in 1819 and ended in 1825. It's a fort that some of you might have been to. It's a famous fort. I'm not going to say anything more than that. But that's really the first chunk of land that the United States government obtained from an indigenous group within the lands of Minnesota, specifically in this case, the Dakota. And then the last thing it states, place a dot on map B where the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers meet. What I would do is just to make sure, and I'm not going to do it right now, again, use that drawing tools, or you can use a shape. Okay, so let's use a shape. You do a circle, dot, there we go. You can just simply, whoops, do that, or you could do the drawing tools, okay, excuse me, and then just kind of make a dot with the drawing tools, whatever works best for you. All right, so I'm going to go back into our Thursday, April 8th folder just to make sure that we understand everything. Actually, I want to go one more back. My apologies. And I just want to keep reinforcing this week so that you get into good habits, that you are always completing everything in social studies in numerical order. So we started with the video that you're listening to now. Then you're going to move on to number 2, and then move on to number 3, and then you're finished for the day. Just make sure that you submit your notes as well as your completed land treaty map to your HOA teacher. Don't submit them to Mr. Gardell. If you don't have me for HOA, submit them to your HOA teacher. All right. As always, kiddos, if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me or your HOA teacher. Take care and have a fantastic day. Bye now.